Welcome again. My name's Colleen. I lead the programming at the Battery. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for overview, how we change the Earth. Tonight's going to be really special and really visual. We're going to get a chance to look at our planet from a different perspective and seeing how patterns that can emerge and what we can learn from them by seeing the transformation caused by our ingenuity and our destruction. We're joined by author of Overview, Timelapse, How We Change the Earth, Ben Grant. Ben is the founder of Overview, a photography project inspiring feelings that stimulate awe, increase desire to collaborate, and foster long-term thinking through imagery, products, and collaborations. And he's joined in conversation with Nick Brysiewicz, the Director of Development at the Long Now Foundation. Friends of the Battery, Long Now is a nonprofit that serves as a center of gravity for long-term projects and long-term thinkers around the world. Ben was kind enough to share a copy of his book, Timelapse, with me, and I have had it on my coffee table ever since. We're in for a really special night of really beautiful images and really important discussion. A couple housekeeping items just before we get started. We are recording tonight and we'll post it on our Battery TV channel after. In the meantime, you guys are muted, but we will get to a Q&A, so you are welcome to put your questions in the chat, think about them. We'll do that towards the end of the discussion. But since we're a fairly small group, we might do some Q&A verbally too. But we'll get started now. And with that, Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And thank you all so much for joining tonight. I'm sure there's been a day of many Zoom calls and screen time. So thanks for opting in for just a little bit more. Hopefully this will be a bit different than everything else you've seen today. To get started, I want to share just some images and some of my work that will give some good context for the conversation that Nick and I will have once I wrap up. So I'm going to share my screen now. Great. So can everyone see it? Nick, thumbs up if it's looking good to you. Great. So I'm the founder of a project called Overview that I started in 2013. The word overview gets its name from this idea known as the overview effect, which is a phenomenon coined by science writer Frank White in 1987 after he spoke with a number of astronauts who had the opportunity to go to outer space and see the entirety of the planet or a large portion of the planet from a great distant vantage point. They saw views that looked a lot like this, traveling around the International Space Station or on the space shuttle. And they came back with this profound awakening, this new feeling of what it meant to be alive, to see the planet in this new way, to reconsider what it means to be a human being and call this place home. So I was very inspired by this idea of the overview effect. I didn't know what to do with it, but simply share this idea. Then one day I went on a mapping program, just like you see here. Apple Maps opened it up on my computer. And because I was so taken by this idea of the overview effect, when it asked me to search for a place or an address that you type in any search bar, it was my instinct at the time to type in Earth. And I thought it would zoom out and show a view just like we saw in that previous video. But to my surprise, when I pressed enter, it did not zoom out to show the whole Earth, but instead zoomed. Ooh, it's asking me to admit someone to the group if someone's able to do that. Oh, thanks, Nick. Thinking it would show a view like this of the whole Earth. Instead, when I pressed enter, it zoomed in. And this is what I saw. This is Earth, Texas, which is a small town in northern Texas. I'd never heard of this before, but this beautiful view filled my screen. You can see these circles that look a lot like pie charts or Pac-Man, and I zoomed in and I was fiddling with the Apple Maps and rotating it. And it was my instinct at the time, because I was doing a lot of photography, to compose the image just like you see here. And make it more like a painting or an abstract piece of art. And then finally just line it up, took a screen capture, and started collecting and amassing these amazing images of the places that humans were creating. That inspired me to start this project, this blog called Daily Overview, where I would create one of these images every day share it on social media. We're getting another admit request if someone's able to do it. Thanks, Nick. And if you look at overview now, if you go on Instagram like you see here and type it in, you'll see our feed of imagery where we collect and share these images. We have more than 1 million followers now, which has been pretty incredible to see the platform grow. And when you type on the image and you go to one like you see here, we're always sure to include the context to give people this understanding of what you're seeing in the frame, which is often, visually very abstract, but important to understand exactly what you're seeing and what you should take away from it. Just to provide a few examples quickly of some of the work that had been featured over the past, 5-6 years since the project started, giving a sense of human impact on the planet. This is deforestation in Bolivia. You can see the untouched rainforest on the right side and the area that's been cleared on the left side for farming, for cattle ranching. And you can see that center track right there, which is perhaps a sign of things to come. Thinking about where our raw materials come from, this is an iron ore mine in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. Thinking about stainless steel, other materials that have to start somewhere, come from the ground. Here's a pretty beautiful and striking example of one of those facilities. Energy, where does our energy come from? Here's a particularly modern and sustainable form of solar energy concentration. This is the solar concentrator in Seville, Spain. Very mesmerizing. And I should say, if you've got a large screen to look at these images, sit back, pour yourself a drink. I wish we could be in the library right now, but take it all in and see these in their full beauty and splendor. And last but not least, the beauty of the cities that we create. This is Barcelona in Spain. You can see the strict urban grid plan there and the octagonal intersections, which are formed to create better ventilation and street parking. You might be wondering, where do these images come from? We now have many partnerships with both private companies and government organizations that enable us to get this incredibly high resolution satellite imagery to create pictures like this as well too. This is from one of our main partners, Maxar, that shows the entirety of the Bay Area from over 800 miles away at an incredibly low angle. Again, offering you an entirely new perspective of seeing the planet or the places that you live. So a lot has happened in the past 6 years. Just to give some bit more context about where the project has gone. We love to take these images into the real world as well too. Here's an example of the images at a building lobby in Barcelona, Spain. Again, giving the context so people can understand what they're seeing, but projecting them on a massive scale and giving the context of environmental degradation and how important it is to protect the planet. Or taking them outside. This is an exhibition we've done the last 4 years in Sweden, building these kind of platforms that are weather resistant so people can see them at all times in rain or snow or summer or winter, you name it, and getting them outside of a gallery space and into the public sphere so that people can see and understand what is going on. Taking the images into the corporate setting. This is an example of a 30-foot mural we did at a Facebook office in the Bay Area. Into people's homes. This is a collection of prints that are sold at CB2 retailers. And one more admit there. Books as well, which is what Colleen so wonderfully introduced. We have a new book, but in 2016, I wrote my first book, Overview, that you can see here, which categorized humanity's impact on the planet into these different chapters: where we live, where we extract, where we waste, where we harvest, etc., to provide this new perspective of the planet that we are creating. Now, in the last, I guess this is a collection of our archive from the last 5 or 6 years, there were so many images that we had created that we actually started to see changes over time within the images, and figuring out what to do with that, how to put that together, led to this most recent project and this most recent book, Timelapse. So thinking about not only how our planet has changed over the grand scale of time, but over the most recent years, since we've been able to observe it, since satellite imagery was available, and also since this project started only 7 years ago. So just to show you how this is possible, when we work with one of our imagery partners, this is actually Planetapses, who's based in San Francisco, you're able to look at particular areas and see that change over time. So trying to find the stories and moments that come together within this incredible library, incredible archives of imagery, to show the change that is important, to give the story of the time that we are living on planet Earth. Some people often refer to it as the Anthropocene, in which human beings are the most dominant force on the planet. But we tried to create a story here that is just super easy to understand, super clear. And that story in time lapse, let me click through, as you saw before, starts with civilization. So the world that we know, the world that we're inhabiting, the world that we're creating. And many of us, like I just showed in San Francisco, are living in cities. So the story starts with urbanization. Now, cities around the world have seen massive growth in recent decades. A particularly visually telling example is the city of Las Vegas, seen here in 1989, the year that I was born. And over the course of my lifetime, you can see it expand massively in size. What you're seeing there is a at least fourfold increase in population, from 700,000 when the first picture was taken to nearly 3 million today. So thinking about cities and the places we inhabit, once we have these cities, we like to move around between them. The second chapter of civilization is transportation. One particularly compelling example is the new Beijing airport, which in 2012 was a large tract of farmland and small towns that look like this. 2015, 3 years later, you can start to see how those towns are no longer there, and that area is no longer being used to farm anything. And then most recently, this airport opened just this past year, has the largest footprint of a single airport terminal, more than 1 million square feet, I believe, and hopefully will be operating at a massive capacity when things get back to normal of around 65 million passengers a year. The last chapter of civilization is consumption. So thinking about all of the things that we have in our life, all of the things that we buy, all of the things that we eat have to come from somewhere, and there is an impact from them. One particularly interesting example that we can all think about is electricity. So here is the beautiful city of Paris, seen during the day. At nighttime, you can see the city of light, as it is known, light up. Forces us to consider where we get our energy and electricity from. Paris gets 50% of its power from cogeneration plants, about 35% from one nuclear power plant, and a very, very, very small percentage from renewable energy sources. Moving into the second section of the book, utilization, it's interesting to think that there are three major resources that we make use of: water, land, and raw materials. Water is important to all forms of life. Nothing could exist without it. And to see how it is used for all sorts of purposes is pretty compelling throughout the entirety of the book. One very moving and stunning example is this one of the Aral Sea, which is in present-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. This used to be the third largest lake in the world. The two rivers that flow into the Aral Sea were diverted to start a cotton industry, seen here in Kazakhstan. So thinking about, the things that we're consuming and creating have to come from somewhere, and here are the resources that have been diverted, literally, to make that possible. Moving into land, this is just a beautiful and kind of nice diversion from all of this environmental destruction. The tulips in Holland bloom every year in April. So if you compare two images, one from March and one from April, you are able to watch them appear and bloom in this magnificent cascade of color. So it's not all doom and gloom. There are positive examples of beauty as well. And last but not least, raw materials. So perhaps the biggest challenge we face right now as a civilization is our dependence on fossil fuels. And this is one of the most disastrous and destructive examples of that. This is the Athabasca oil sands in Canada and northern Canada, which has expanded to meet the ever increasing need for oil. So you can see it in 1997, 2001, 2009, and then most recently here. The supply here is staggering as well too. There could be enough oil here to create 2.5 million barrels of oil per day for the next 186 years. So there's going to need to be a conscious decision about moving away from fossil fuels to more sustainable energy sources to avoid what we see in the final chapter here, which is the reaction. Quite simply put, there is too much carbon in the atmosphere. So looking at the number of parts per million as measured yesterday in Hawaii, these numbers are off the charts. And it's all because of all of these things we're doing, all of the things we're seeing in the civilization chapter, all of the things we're seeing in the utilization chapter, primarily this pumping of carbon and methane into the atmosphere. So what are we seeing as a result of this, simple equation? There's too much carbon in the atmosphere. It is changing Earth's natural systems because they are out of balance. So the first chapter of reaction is here, nature. Just a few examples. In 2018, unprecedented flooding in the Midwest United States at the Nebraska-Iowa border. You can see the area here before, and then completely overflown with water. It feels like a lifetime ago, but the Australian bushfires were, in the year 2000, which is last year. Again, feels like forever ago, but at the time, this was the biggest story in the world. You can see this massive amount of area covered and scorched by fire here, so big that the following day on January 1st, 2020, you could see this massive plume of gray smoke rising from the continent. However, it's not all doom and gloom. As I said, we can respond to this problem that we have created. Quite simply put, I think there are two ways of doing that. You can remove some of the carbon that's already in the air. One way of doing that is this natural, incredible technology that exists. It's called trees. This is the Great Green Wall of Africa and the Sahel region there, which looks to restore, degraded land and put in millions of trees along a massive stretch to prevent desertification coming in from the desert there seen on the right. I can do that one more time. Just absolutely stunning effort that needs to be known about, needs to have a spotlight shown on it, because this project and many others like it require significant investment if they're going to work and succeed. And lastly, making use of land and area that is not being used at all. This is a massive distribution warehouse in Los Angeles that was converted into the largest rooftop solar installation in the United States, now powers thousands of homes in the surrounding area for something that was not being used at all before. It was just a roof. So being thoughtful, being inventive, rethinking the way we're doing things. And the last thing I'll say is the subtitle of Timelapse is how we change the Earth. And on the surface, that might be looking backwards, and it's an example of this visual history that's shown how we've changed the Earth to date. But I'm also optimistic that if we understand how we've changed the Earth so far, we'll also know and understand how to change it for the better going forward. So ending on that positive example, thinking about what we can do to create a better and safer and smarter planet for our one and only home. So with that, I am very excited to introduce Nick, and I hope Nick can introduce himself a bit too, and say a bit more about Long Now. It should be hopefully pretty obvious why I wanted him to be here with us this evening, as a philosopher and wise expert on all things time related. But Nick, feel free to say a bit more about the work that you guys are doing, and yeah, just pumped to have you here tonight. So.
Well, thanks for having me, Ben, and thanks for that fantastic presentation on your book. I enjoy this story more each and every time I hear it. So thank you, and thank you to the Battery for hosting this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about some of these ideas with you tonight, Ben. Of course, as the introduction said, I'm the Director of Development at an organization called the Long Now Foundation. And Long Now is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to foster long-term thinking. And when we talk about long-term, we don't mean just the next election cycle or the next business quarter, but we're talking about the next in the last 10,000 years of human civilization. So our main project is still one of our most mythic projects and is still under construction, is that we're building a clock that'll keep good time for the next 10,000 years. It's currently being constructed inside of a mountain in West Texas. But since that project launched, we've also developed a seminar series where we have people come talk about long-term thinking. And that's actually where Ben and I originally met, when Ben came and did a seminar for us a couple of years back. We have a special archiving program, which has landed special archives of human language on a comet. We've landed one on the moon, There's about 100 of these archives hidden all over the planet here terrestrially. We have a long-term betting platform. We have an award-winning cocktail bar in San Francisco called The Interval that some people here might have been to in the past. And we're looking forward to having cocktails with people on the other side of all this. We have spun off a genomic technology project called Revive and Restore that has had its hands in the de-extinction of the woolly mammoth and other opportunities to advance conservation projects with genomic technology. And then, of course, we have a global membership program in 65 countries, 11,000 long-term thinkers all around the globe from every conceivable discipline, background, and geography. And we're pulling people together to think about what the future really could look like and to do exactly what you're doing, Ben, with this book. And I've got my copy, of course, right here as well. But with Timelapse, which is getting people not only to see what we're doing to the world, but to imagine what we could do to the world if we really put our heads together and really worked in the right effort. And so this is kind of interesting. It's maybe an interesting place for us to launch, is to talk about this idea then of scale and what happens when you change your default scale. So instead of, just looking out your window, all of a sudden you're on Google Earth, or you're looking at, satellite images, and all of a sudden, the scale of space that you're looking at is going from, a normal human proximity to all of a sudden hundreds of miles up off the surface of the Earth. And, I think for us, one of the things we notice with time scale expansion is that the things you notice change, that the things that you are able to see and the things that draw your attention when you're looking at something, just the way you always look at it, the way people look at things, time or space. But then all of a sudden you really kind of give yourself that moment to expand things out. And I've kind of joked with you, Ben, here on the boat, that we're kind of in the awe business of like just kind of creating these experiences for people to see things a little bit differently than they have in the past. But scale for you, I love that the overview was all about scale. And then with this latest project, with the Timelapse project, you kind of introduced this temporal element to it. So not only have you completely blown up the spatial scale we're looking at things, but now you're actually watching it change for a little bit. And I'm kind of curious for you, if there's some things that for you in researching this project, were there things that all of a sudden became salient that you had never thought about before, things that all of a sudden stuck out to you?
Yeah, I love what you said about the things that you notice change. And one slight tweak on that, which I might add in addition to that, is the things that you can notice change. You're simply able to observe the world in an entirely new way. I think the first book and the project before this did that. I mean, it takes you mentally into the satellite, and you're looking down at the Earth in a view that perhaps not even an astronaut could have, because they don't have access to the high technology that's in these satellites. But yes, adding the temporal addition in this book makes you realize all sorts of things, and it became a search to find these particularly compelling stories where it isn't necessarily obvious each time when you look at a sequence of images what the difference is or what's happened. But what is most compelling? What is the kind of the golden nuggets within these archives of satellite imagery that really tell the story of our time, what is happening here?
Yeah, and I love time lapses. I don't know. I imagine you must have been a fan of various time lapse footage before doing this project. But there's so
Yeah.
many. I mean, it's just some of my favorite stuff to watch. Whether it's the films like Samsara or Baraka,
Mm-hmm.
which really, a
Mm-hmm.
central part of some of those films is some beautiful
Koyana
time lapse
Squatsi.
footage.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Koyaanisqatsi.
Yeah.
And then even on Instagram, now that we all have cameras in our pockets that can do time lapse footage, you see some of the coolest stuff,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's somebody just speeding through a yoga routine, which is just interesting in its
Yeah.
own right, or I've recently become kind of enamored with like houseplant time lapses. There's
Mm-hmm.
including
Mm-hmm.
this one particular account called Houseplant Journal, but they basically just you watch your houseplants. You think your houseplants are just inert, that they're just kind of sitting there
Mm-hmm.
doing nothing all day while you're at work or on Zoom calls. And it's absolutely false. These things are completely alive and they're moving, but you would never notice it at human timescales. You kind of have to watch a
Yeah.
24-hour daylight cycle take place to see how they react to the light changes. And it's just
Yeah.
amazing to see that kind of a thing. And so there's almost like, in the case of houseplants, for me, there's like an empathy extension that comes from seeing these scale
Uh-huh.
changes and these time lapses. But I think with your
And you'll
project,
never look at them the same way again, right? It
no,
forever changes your relationship with your plants and the way you think about them and how you treat them. And that's just one very small example, but it's completely shifting what you know and how you think about the world.
Absolutely. It absolutely catalyzes a change for you.
Hmm.
And so this project, in addition to catalyzing a ton of changes, like the other thing that I really just love about the time lapse idea here is that, these things that do stick out to you are things that are falling into all kinds of categories, at least for me, there's the real neutral stuff like the tulip blooms, which is like just gorgeous.
Hmm.
It's just aesthetically, it apprehends you in a really beautiful way.
Hmm.
And then you've got the things that are they're showing you something almost like the scars that we're leaving, whether it's scars of
Hmm.
overdevelopment or agriculture kind of encroaching in on wild forestation. You've got images in there of landfills, and those things kind of, for me,
Hmm.
kind of show forth like very specific ways in which humanity is impacting the planet, and perhaps not as mindfully or as thoughtfully as we could be. And then there's some
Hmm.
images that you've gotten here, which I'm so glad you've gotten here because it kind of really aligns with the Long Now mission, which is there are images here of ways in which humans are shaping the planet in positive ways, in positive directions,
Hmm.
whether it's things like wind farms. You've got some images here of various other infrastructural projects, water treatment plants, things that are really helping human beings live flourishing lives. And these are the things that we can do that
Hmm.
also can be visible from space as well. And I'm curious, when you were collecting these, one of the things I noticed as I'm flipping through the pages of time lapse is that some of these images hit me with more emotion than others. And
Hmm.
truthfully, in truth, in an honest confession, some of the scar-like or like the difficult negative impacts of humanity on the planet, they tend to be the most
Hmm.
emotionally salient ones for me, where I'm just like kind of like my breath is taken away a little bit, and I'm just kind of struck by some of this stuff. And I
Yeah.
was curious, like, were you struck by anything in particular? Was it the negative images? Were the positive images striking to you? Was it the aesthetic stuff that was just beautiful?
Yeah, what comes to mind right away, and perhaps it was the most visceral because I remember it so well, were the fires and the imagery, were the imagery of the fires in California. Um, Not just showing, the grand scale of the flames burning, but the destruction and the aftermath of an entire town like Paradise, California, before and after, and all of the houses are gone. And I think there's a moment for me when I'm making these images where I sometimes have to disconnect and not, necessarily think about what is in the frame, but just compose it in the best way possible, no matter what I'm showing, no matter how horrible it is. Um, but then you kind of click back into it and you remember, that is someone's livelihood, that is someone's life, perhaps, that was lost there, and it becomes incredibly difficult to show. And I think there has to be a decision made in a book like this or with the posts on our daily feed about finding that balance. Um, I don't want to be, a newspaper of the apocalypse and just showing all of the
Mm-hmm.
destruction. I think you need to find the positive stories, as you're saying as well. But um, that one in particular, I think it needed to be shown. Um, and it's interesting with the two fire stories, zooming in and showing the destruction of the town versus zooming out and showing the scale of everything from outer space, outer space, like I showed in Australia. Both strike you in their own way, but I think, as human beings, as people who live in California, that one in particular was tough to look at. Was really tough to look at.
Yeah, and good or bad, these things are striking. They are emotionally like laden, and for me, there's an encounter there. Like an
Hmm.
encounter with any good artwork that's going to transform you in the way you see the world a little bit. Like these
Hmm.
pieces that you put together have their own aesthetic dimension. They're fundamentally artworks that you're putting out there. They're
Hmm.
compositions, and in addition to just being beautiful artworks, like they are creating the preconditions for people to have an encounter they wouldn't otherwise have, and love wonderfully at
Hmm.
scale, at these beautiful scales.
Mm.
But I'm so fascinated by this myself because Long Now is so involved in large scale artworks, and a lot of the
Hmm.
stuff we do has this flavor of being an aesthetic intervention. And I think there's real change that's possible through helping people see things differently than they've ever seen things. Famously, the president, one of the founders of the Long Now Foundation, Stuart Brand, was the publisher of the Whole Earth Catalog, which on its last issue on the back
Hmm.
page, it showed you an image of the whole planet. The whole Earth was
Hmm.
right there, just hanging in space, and that iconic image really transformed the way a lot of people thought about the planet that we share and the limitations of it, and
Hmm.
just how how not necessarily alone we are, but how we're kind of just hanging in a whole bunch of black nothingness, and
Yeah.
everything we've got to care about is right here. And so these images can really catalyze things. And I'm interested in what they can do in a world that has kind of lost its ability to argue in a way
Hmm.
that is like mutually respectful or unifying. It's really divisive the way that we've learned to argue. We've kind of unlearned to argue with each other in positive, convergent ways. I still see a
Yeah.
lot of hope and promise in the realm of aesthetics for allowing us to
Hmm.
put forth things that'll catalyze and change the way each other see things. So I love this project. I mean, have you
Hmm.
thought about that as far as like your role in the larger global conversation and what these artworks can do?
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said there, and I think there's something very objective about these images. I think there's not much up for dispute, right? It's almost hard data at the end of the day, and it's showing, on the grand scale, objectivity. Um, I also think the images are operating on the artistic level, as you said, right? I have to do a good job composing them and figuring out how much to rotate the image, how much to crop the image, to do whatever I can to get people to pay attention and to get them to stop scrolling on Instagram, or to get them to stop flipping through the book, to find something that pulls them in. So while abstract art might not be for everyone, using the principles of abstract art to compose these images to get people to feel something, or to react to something, or to use patterns or composition or color to get people to look a bit deeper. Um, I think those can all be operating at the same time, and can create, ultimately, as you're saying, an experience for someone.
Yeah, yeah, and I think like the scale of this, we're kind of you're creating and framing these things aesthetically in a certain context of time. But it's my understanding that
Yeah.
most of satellite imagery is only about 60 years old, right? It wasn't like the 1960s that this really took off. And yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so what I'm thinking
Even
is like,
less so. I mean,
yeah,
30, 40 for
30,
the
40
good
years.
stuff that we would view as, modern day satellite imagery. Yeah.
And some of the development stuff you have with cities like really charts those 30 years out in a really cool way, where you can just even tell that the satellite imagery is just going to be gangbusters in the future. And I'm kind of curious, like, if we're going to allow
Hmm.
ourselves a little whimsy here in this conversation, I'm kind of curious, like,
Hmm.
the long now angle on the time lapse would be, okay, so you've blown out the spatial dimension. What would happen? What would you want to blow out in the temporal dimension if we had satellite imagery rolling all the way back? Do you have anything that you
Yeah.
think would just be really amazing to see aesthetically, if you had access to satellite footage going back 10,000 years? Anything in particular that sticks out to you as something that would be worth seeing?
It would probably be a little gloomy, but what comes to mind right away is World War II.
Mm,
Just, seeing a lot of these places that I've shown, like the particular beauty of European city planning, was completely destroyed in most places. So thinking about, the before and after, and then also the after to now, right, of rebirth almost of civilization in Europe in a lot of countries. Um, I think about, environmental disasters of the past. Um, Pompeii might be pretty
yeah.
fascinating if you could see, a city covered in ash. But yeah, I think, the fact that these stories are also, not yet written, or it's constantly changing, it's constantly dynamic, um, makes me excited too, right? And I think that goes into the bit about being optimistic and showing a future that's not yet created. We're only able to look deep into the past, and perhaps, as we're saying, not as deep as we would like. Um, but I would love to be able to project in some way, and I think that's where my skills are kind of limited, right? You would need truly someone who's an artist or an architect or a planner to be able to take what is currently there and show how it has changed for the better. But that's what we need. And I think once people see something, kind of as we're saying, it makes it much easier to believe that it's possible, or to inspire more ideas, because they've seen one idea and they say, maybe I need to fix that, or maybe that's not going to work, but what if we did this? And it's incredible to imagine what might happen if we put stuff before people. So maybe that's a project for another day, but there's something there
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, and you've really planted that seed by putting these images out there, you know, as much as we can't roll back the time lapse 10,000 years and see things like the phases of construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza, which would be great to see, or, you know, the
That
great
was a good one.
oxidation
Yeah.
event from 2.5 billion years ago, which would be really interesting to see the
Yeah.
entire planet change colors. Like, as much as we can't do that, we are at the beginning of the next 10,000 years. And when you
Yeah.
think about it, we're going to have satellite images from everything happening now, probably all through the next 10,000 years. And so at some point,
Yeah.
somebody's going to be able to make that time lapse. And we get to
Hmm.
be inside of the thing that's being time lapsed and thinking, what kind of ways do
Hmm.
we want to see these images change in our lifetime? And how do we want to set these images to change up across many lifetimes? Because a lot of these things that you're tracking and I think that are worth tracking, they're going to take place on the time scale of centuries or millennia, or even, you know, the time
Yeah.
scale of civilization, 10,000 years itself. And so we're inside the next time
Yeah.
lapse. Hopefully you're going to have a book in 10,000 years, which will
I
cover
hope
all of
so.
this. And hopefully there'll be an entire section on all the awesome stuff that we started doing from 2021 on forward. And I'm just so
Yeah.
grateful that you put this out there to inspire all those artists to think about what the future could be like. This is where it all begins, man. And I'm really grateful you made
Yeah.
this book.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think the word is often overused now, but making things more green, I think, is something to think about too. Because if we're viewing, you know, things like trees as a potential solution to the problem, you'll be able to see that solution. And in my first book, there was a particularly compelling example that showed, I believe it was East Palo Alto, right next to Atherton in the Bay Area. And you could see the areas that were wealthy with lots of trees around all of the homes, and you could see the dense areas that were not as affluent with very few trees. And there are not many examples around the world where you can see that disparity right next to each other, but it shows us, you know, what ultimately creates happiness, what ultimately creates a good environment, what ultimately creates good, clean air. So, you know, moving in a greener direction, I think, is something that we could potentially see from above, and I hope to see more and more of it as time progresses. But
Yeah. Do you think that ends
yeah,
up making things just look a little more wild? Or do you think that means, like, you know, what is that? What do you think that looks like? Would you venture a stab at that?
uh, you know, wild is an interesting word. I remember going to the city of Vancouver for the first time and just being struck by how all of the nature, which, you know, wasn't actually natural, but all of the green and all of the plants and all of the trees were so integrated into the city. um, Even being, you know, on the buildings or on top of the buildings. um, and it was really inspiring. I think it's like a place that we could move towards in a lot of other cities around the world, where we're integrated back in, and it's not like nature has overtaken civilization, but it's just moving towards a greater harmony, greater balance. um, and it feels good. Like, I think you know, it hits you in a different way. um, so that's something I think to move towards. It's not entirely the solution, right? I don't think putting a few rooftop gardens in the cities around the world is going to remove all the carbon we need to remove from the atmosphere. But I think it's also moving people closer to a greater connection with nature, which I think is part of the solution here as well too. You know, not being surrounded by concrete all the time, that you forget that you're on a ball floating in outer space that has, you know, far too many parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. You actually need to be reminded of where you are and the impact that we have on the planet. And, you know, if it's just a few trees on your street or an occasional trip into the redwoods, it's all essential, I think, to mitigate our impact and create a better future.
Well, and I think with Daily Overview being an Instagram account, it is providing these reminders every day to millions of people around the globe, right where they're
Hmm.
probably the most distracted, right? Right when they're just kind of
Hmm.
like the least connected to things. You're just kind of scrolling mindlessly
Mm.
in line for something. All of a sudden, you know,
Yeah.
I'll get hit with an image like just like the cover image here, and it for me at least,
Hmm.
it always gives me as kind of permission or a reminder just to stop, pause, and
Yeah.
reflect a little bit on a bigger picture. And it's just really great. I mean, I'm so glad that you've peppered my newsfeed with these images. It's been a life improvement to surf Instagram in a world where we've got, daily overview and houseplant journal kind of reminded me to take a different perspective on time and space pretty regularly. And I think that's what Long Now is kind of in the business of doing too, is also just kind of creating opportunities for people, giving people permission in certain protected spaces to finally just think about things differently, just for now, just for this little bit of time. It doesn't have to be a complete reframing of your life. You don't have to put all your possessions in storage and completely change your lifestyle. You just got to take a few breaths and kind of focus on this other perspective for a moment. I think that's really healthy for all of those balancing reasons you mentioned.
Absolutely. Yeah. And as you're saying about Instagram, I think that is the world that is most focused on the self, right? The things that are typically very popular on Instagram are celebrity or models or, individuals, and not anything really related to the collective. And I think the work that Long Now is doing, and hopefully the work that I'm doing too, is to inspire this awe, which will hopefully get people to be more collaborative, to stop thinking about themselves as much, to think about, what they can do for the world at large. So the fact that it's kind of been, Trojan horsed in there to Instagram, I think is hopefully pretty compelling, and it's good to hear it. It works for you to get you to stop and zoom out. And I hope it works for many more people as well too, because for me, that would make the work pretty fulfilling and pretty impactful. So. Yeah.
Well, and you've been doing the Instagram thing since early days relative to the rest of the world, right? Like you really, I mean, can we call you an Instagram influencer? Is that the preferred nomenclature? Like, do you get like that kind of credit? But like, in a certain sense, I wonder if you're shaping what people think about as influential content. Like, I would imagine that most people, when they were thinking about the kinds of narcissistic posts you see on Instagram, they weren't obviously thinking that the stuff that people would really relish is content like this. And yet you've got a very successful Instagram account on your hands, which is really touching a lot of people's lives. Do you think, I'd imagine somebody in that industry that loose industry has to be watching something like the Daily Overview and seeing an opportunity for content that enriches people's lives. And I have to imagine that you've left some fingerprints on that world. Anybody you've run into? Have you been in conferences where you've run into other like positive, reframed, scaled, expanding content creators?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind is I think there was a movement, especially during the pandemic, of like good news. And I think not just, focusing on the doom and gloom, but all of these different accounts popping up that got big followings, that were focused on, shining a light on things that deserve to be known. And they weren't, violence or death headlines. They were very positive, uplifting things. And I think there needs to be a balance with everything, but in a similar way, focused on something that is not the norm, and people kind of latching onto that and feeling inspired by it. A lot of other interesting run-ins with people kind of finding the account and thinking it's one thing, but maybe it's another. But Instagram is a crazy world, and I hope I'm not an influencer, but maybe I'm influencing for the better, hopefully. So
yeah. I think you're one of the good guys, Ben, and I'm glad you're out there like doing this very important, very meaningful work in a context that is like thirsty for it. I think that's just really the right place for it. Find people when they're the most distracted. Remind them they're on a spinning rock.
Yeah, I think something that we can do too, which is kind of a hack, is that we can connect people from all around the world just through the imagery, right? We're able to show them other places around the planet that they wouldn't necessarily travel to, or they have traveled to, and it reminds them of it. But the fact that all of the images are presented, from the same vantage point, I think puts them all on an equal playing field, and people can learn about new things, or start conversations, and there's discourse with people from different countries about different topics or different things that are happening. And that's pretty powerful. That is not just the internet, but that is something like a platform like Instagram, giving people instant access to have conversations and learn about new things, and expand their horizons, literally. So that's pretty cool to think about, and it certainly happens every day. I don't know how much it happens, but it's certainly happening. So we should be doing that as much as we can.
Here, sign me up. We are coming to time a little bit, and we want to make some time for Q&A with the audience. And so we've got one question in the chat here that we'll kick it off with, which is, have you seen any impact from your image sources in the past year during COVID?
Yeah, so we were actually able to get a few images into the book related to the pandemic. It was, the final stages of the edits, but we figured this would be the most important story of all time or during our lifetimes. So we were able to show the construction of the hospital in Wuhan, China, that they built in, I believe, 10 days. So you can see the before and after of what was a park turned into a massive hospital in relatively no time at all. And also social distancing measures when we were all learning about that phrase for the first time, social distancing, at the Kaaba in Mecca, where usually you can see, tens of thousands of people, just a mass of people from outer space. There aren't many places where you can see people clearly from satellite. That is one of them. And then in March of last year, they had a barrier constructed so people couldn't get close to the rock at the center and were forced to stay far apart. Over the past few months, there's been a lot more stuff that's popped up. It's interesting, the project was always focused on human activity for the last 6 or 7 years, and this has been a time of relative inactivity. So oftentimes you were showing the absence of activity, or planes not in the sky but planes being grounded, or boats not going through the canals in Venice but nothing going through the canals in Venice. So we certainly have slowed down a bit. Unfortunately, emissions numbers haven't dropped as much as people would have hoped through all this time. But we've been able to observe, these changes and also the lack of activity, which has been pretty cool to see as well.
Yeah, here on the water in Sausalito, I live here on the water, and right when COVID started happening last summer, we started seeing like some algae blooms that people had kind of suspected were going a little nuts because of the lack of pollution in there as well. So, so it's kind of it'll be interesting to see what we can see on the on the long tail of all of this. We've got another question from the audience here, which is, are there any restrictions to taking pictures from space? Can governments or large landowners assert some kind of privacy or security rights, or is it all fair game? Can you just shoot anything you want?
So I certainly have restrictions on what I can access. I'm sure there are accounts for the government where they can see things in much higher resolution.
So you're going to do a classified edition?
Yeah, it'll cost significantly more, but it's coming next year. So I certainly don't even know what I haven't seen. But there are some interesting examples of European governments primarily who have kind of put up these kind of blur zones over certain classified areas, like nuclear power plants in France is one. I know the Dutch government was blocking certain areas, and there have actually been other artists who have just taken snippets of the blurred out areas as art, to talk about this idea of privacy, to talk about this idea of access. Because satellite imagery, we haven't talked about this at all, was created primarily for surveillance purposes. It wasn't made for art necessarily, or environmental awareness. That has all happened now in recent years. But it's a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, Google Earth only became available to the public in, I believe it was 2005. So while perhaps everyone growing up now these days will always be aware of it and always think about it, I remember the first time I was able to log into Google Earth. I think it was called Keyhole at the time. And everyone always searches for their home first to see where they're from, which I think is a pretty telling example, and then they kind of expand their horizons from there. But yeah, I think there's definitely a kind of subplot here about making use of something that was not intended for this, but could be used for the better. So yeah.
Do you feel like you're kind of surveilling civilization at this point?
I think the word surveilling carries a lot of
it is a fraud. It is a bit of a fraud term. Yeah.
But I feel like monitoring is perhaps a better word. Like you're keeping
Or
an eye on
curating?
it. I think it's absolutely curating as well too. Sometimes I think people have the ability to expose certain things from outer space as well too. There's been some recent work that's been done of these detention facilities, the Uyghurs in China, where they were able to shine a light on what's going on, or of course the government does it to monitor other countries' nuclear weapons programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think with something like the cover of this book, monitoring the recession of glaciers and tracking ice caps. I know organizations like NASA are doing incredible work all the time to keep an eye on that. I think that the idea of the eye in the sky, Big Brother, can be frightening at times, but it's also so essential right now. I think the severity of the crisis that we face, we need to know where we stand, and we need to know how quickly the environmental destruction is happening. So I hope more people get access to this imagery so that they can, make use of it and hopefully, turn the tide in the other direction.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's also in some ways like a Fitbit for the planet, right? Where it's a way for people to actually measure
Mm-hmm.
things. I've got some friends who work in satellite data stuff where they're basically tracking nefarious activity in certain areas, but also just like when I say nefarious activity, I mean like deforestation stuff that's not supposed to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
They can see that happening, and they can send people on the ground to kind of take care of it. And then I also have friends who are using
Yeah.
it to de-risk insurance profiles. So things like
Mm-hmm.
wildfire
Mm-hmm.
activity can be like de-risked with a lot more information from satellites. So giving that access to this kind of stuff to people, to be really creative. One person sees an art project, another person sees a way to make get an edge in an insurance profile. It's really kind of interesting. It will be
Yeah.
interesting to see in our lifetimes what people do with this information.
Yeah, it also makes me think too. There's like a whole other world that I haven't delved into, which is an entirely new way of seeing things when people have put different sensors on these satellites to monitor methane emissions, and they can focus on certain refineries, and they can see where leaks are that if you were sitting on the ground right next to it, you wouldn't have the vision to see that. And I think Daily Overview has just been focused on kind of the RGB bands as they're known, or kind of the visible world as we see it as human beings. But there is a whole nother um, spectrum to dive into, where you can see things and understand things in an entirely new way, often for more scientific reasons. But again, that's expanding our horizons and potentially using it for planetary saving purposes. Yeah.
Well, Ben, we're getting close to the end of time, and I'm so grateful to you and the Battery and everybody who's here with us today, who joined us for this conversation. Thank you all so much. This is a wonderful way to spend a Tuesday evening. I guess we should just end it with maybe one last question, Ben, and I'll tee you up with a really easy one, which is just where is this going next? So the book's out. Where does it go next? Are you going to be on a book tour as soon as you get your COVID vaccination, or what's new, what's coming up for you?
I would love an excuse for us to all gather in the library at the Battery, when we can, as soon as possible, for some sort of event. We'll have to figure out what that is. Maybe we'll just do this. We'll just run this back in person. It's an interesting time for me to figure out, what's next. As you said, perhaps there's another book in the future. I would love to create more tangible impact campaigns, which is something I'm working on right now. We've been doing a lot of work around awareness, these past few years, showing people what's going on, how amazing it would be to not just have people's eyeballs and attention, but using their engagement on Instagram to do things like plant trees or to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So finding the right partners for that has been an interesting challenge recently. But being able to shine a spotlight on these potential solutions, I think, is the underlying focus. And if we can do even more to support them either financially or through these partnerships, that's something I really want to do. So there's other product stuff going on and other new product announcements that we've got on our website. People can definitely check that out. But I think underlying all of it, we want to see what impact we can have and continue to blow people's minds and change their perspective for the better.
That sounds fantastic. If I can suggest a 10,000-year project, I think if we put $1 and 1 Bitcoin into a trust In 10,000 years, we can probably do another edition of the book for sure. We'll make sure there's an entire
Oh,
staff to
definitely.
scrub through 10,000 years of satellite imagery. So
Yeah,
thank you
the
so.
surveillance edition will cost 1 Bitcoin, but we'll figure that out later.
Well, thank you again so much for this. Thanks for putting this book together. It's honestly one of the favorite things I have here on the boat, and it never fails to get conversation started. And there are just days where I just I need it. I need to take a step back. And so thank you for providing the reminders. And thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Colleen and the Battery. It's really great to spend the evening with you all.
Yeah, thanks again, Nick and Ben. That was awesome. Really appreciate you all sharing that conversation and all these images with us. It's so important, like you said, from an impact perspective, but also from an artistic perspective. So thank you for putting a project like this out into the world. We dropped a link to Ben's book, so if you're interested in purchasing that. Also, some people hit me up asking if they do artwork. They do prints, so go and check out it on the website and you can get your own print to put this beautiful artwork up on the wall. But we will wrap things up for now. We'll post this and send a link out to everybody so you can share this with your friends. And thanks again, guys. We'll see you at the Battery really soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.